So welcome to tonight's event. Welcome to the Center on National Security at Fordham Law. I want to begin tonight by thanking our partner, our co-host in tonight's event, which is PEN America Center, and its executive director, Suzanne Nossel, who helped us put this together. We're very excited to be partnering with them for the second time in a very short period of time. You know that PEN America is devoted to free expression and to anything that, and to addressing any issues that impede free expression. So they are a very good partner for the center to work with, and we are grateful to have them here tonight. This is a, there you go. This is a very exciting evening for us. We've wanted to address the topic of the NSA, of Edward Snowden, and what's become known as the Edward Snowden issue. There are very few people who get to have issues named after them, and who get to have the President of the United States mention them twice in their major policy speeches. So it's a topic that I think the center is going to be addressing for a long time coming. What we're going to be debating here tonight is how to assess what should be done in the case of Snowden in terms of his culpability. We're going to address, as a result, many other issues, but we wanted to focus on the one that's sort of at the edges of the debate. Will there be clemency? Should there be clemency? What would it mean to have clemency? I think one of the reasons that so many people are interested in this debate is not just the free expression matter, but just what has happened to the United States in the war on terror. And this is one more iteration, the surveillance issue, of what the United States government did, often secretly, often in violation of constitutional rights, often illegally, to try to protect the American people. And so in a way, I guess we're stuck in this debate for a long time to come. For many of us, the surveillance issue is one that we didn't know about until the middle of the first Bush presidency. And every year we're finding out more and more. So I'm not really sure, and I don't think anyone here is where this story is going to go. We have a stellar group of speakers tonight. Amy Davidson from the New Yorker, Jonathan Capehart from the Washington Post and from MSNBC frequently. But I want to spend a few minutes talking about our moderator, David McCraw, who has been here before, and it is my pleasure to invite back. And I want to tell you why. He is the Assistant General Counsel at the New York Times. Can you imagine? What a great job to have in this day and age. So other than the obvious, one of the things that he is responsible for is FOIA litigation. And so he has had the pleasure or the responsibility, however you would like to assess it, of having to do or getting to do the FOIA litigation on things like the targeted killing programs and where is the memo that the United States government produced that the public still does not have. He's also been involved in the FOIA litigation for documents from the Pentagon that had to do with using former officials to spread the word about the government's position in the media. He's also been involved in FOIA litigation that had to do with getting secret tapes from the first responders from 9/11. So he's covered the gamut of national security issues and freedom of information and what the public needs to know in a way very few people have. So I think he's the perfect moderator for tonight, and I hope to have him back. But David, I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. I'm very happy that when Karen does that introduction, she doesn't reveal how many of those cases I lost. Okay. You know, yeah, and when I was asked to do this, of course, I was happy to be on the stage with Jonathan and Amy, who have written about this issue so vibrantly and in such interesting ways. But it reminded me that this past summer I was in the Republic of Georgia doing a seminar for law students. I happened to run into an American couple while I was there, and they invited me out for dinner. Went out to dinner with their 2 children, and their 8-year-old daughter, we're sitting outside at this restaurant on the Black Sea, and their 8-year-old daughter keeps turning to her mother and says, "Mommy, can I ask the man the question?" "No, not yet, not yet." "Mommy, can I ask the man the question?" So we get into dinner, and finally, Mom says, "Ask the question." And this 8-year-old girl, American girl, living in the Republic of Georgia says, "Edward Snowden, hero or criminal?" Now, I was struck by several things at that moment. One is, isn't that amazing, the reach of that? You know, here we are, millions of miles from America. This 8-year-old girl had this question. The second one, the one thing I was passionate about, why do people bring their kids to dinner to ask embarrassing questions of adults? That's a really bad form. And the third thing was, you know, how complicated this question is for me. I spent a lot of time swimming in these waters, and it's a very simple question. It's very complex. And so, fortunately, I did come up with what you say to an 8-year-old in that situation, which is there a third choice? And that shut her up. I don't think we're going to have that reaction tonight. Fortunate to have people who have spoken so compellingly about this issue. My role as moderator here is really just to facilitate the discussion. I will, of course, oversimplify and make a mess of their positions, which are very nuanced in order to be provocative, but they can set me straight. So what I'd like to start with, and we haven't gone over any of the questions here. This is going to be a fairly spontaneous discussion, but we did agree that it would be good for each of them to spend a few minutes just sort of outlining their position before I make a hash of it. So, Amy, you want to begin?
Sure, and thank you, and hello. I think that just to, in a way, start with the question you were asked, the hero or criminal question. What struck me when you said that was that those are really two things in different categories. Criminal is about specific things that you've done that violate a law or don't. Hero tends to be about character, and I think that that's where the discussion gets really confused for a lot of people. I tend to think that there's not just one case for, let's say, amnesty or clemency. I think, as a side note, that I'm not a lawyer, and we get these words all confused, whether it's amnesty or clemency or just a deal that would allow Edward Snowden to not spend the rest of his life in jail. So should we agree to just conflate all of those things a little bit?
I'm all about conflation, yes.
So when I say clemency, say that doesn't necessarily, that can mean a couple of different things. It could mean a plea bargain in some way that's some people would see as generous and others would see as just perfectly just. But again, I think that there are two cases for that go in different directions. And in a way, the supporters of each are, I think, put off by the other to an extent that makes it almost hard to arrive at a deal. One of them, I think you could say, is the case of what Edward Snowden has done for America broadly. There's this, the idea that he's started a discussion that nobody else could, at risk to himself. The president himself said that he made the country stronger. He'd gotten information out when our normal mechanisms in Congress and in the courts had failed to, and that in a way he's earned his freedom. That's one very emotional case for people. The other side you might call what Edward Snowden could still do for the government. And there's an argument here that it's not in anybody's interest that he's a fugitive and out there. The government still does not have a good sense, so it's been reported, of what he has or how exactly he got it. One can imagine a plea deal that involves him sort of helping them rein some things in, explain what happened, explain how it happened, how perhaps they could make their security a little bit better so that all of our information that's in government hands doesn't sort of walk out the door, and learn some lessons from it, and so that there could be real benefits to the government from coming to some understanding with him. Now, again, I think that the problem is that the people who's in the government who've talked about how he should be, hung by his neck, how he should be shot, they're so deranged by what they see as just the wrongness of the first argument, that he's done something good for America and he deserves this, that in a way they don't even are not even quite able to think about the country's and the government's practical interest in not having him sort of stranded in Russia, not having, you know, this lack of knowledge out of there, leaving it only to reporters to, and I believe reporters are, you know, working really hard to, when they go through these papers, not actually, you know, damage or hurt people with what they publish. So, you know, there's a way that side can. Now, the other side, the side that loves Snowden, is grateful to him, sees what he's done for the country, is, I think, in some ways quite uncomfortable with the other argument that I outlined, and wonders, like, I wonder even if there's a point where some of Snowden's supporters would want him to turn down certain sorts of deals that guaranteed his freedom, because the idea that there's anything but complete transparency about it, or any kind of negotiation, or that he might have to admit or, you know, acknowledge law-breaking or acknowledge guilt or culpability in some way, seems so radically unfair that that's a discussion they don't quite want to have. So in other words, I think that there's these two cases I don't think they've been brought together properly because of the emotions that so many people have, and what they see is just and you know, have reasons to see as the unfairness and the justice and the patriotism that comes into the assessment of what he's done in every way. So I think that in a way, I think that finding a way to some sort of clemency should, in a way, be really easy, because it's in both sides, everybody's interests. But, and yet it's so hard to talk about without people just throwing up their hands and saying, but he's a bad person, but he's a hero, and without talking about what is actually good for the country.
Don't throw up your hands, but.
You know, Amy said something to me when we met just outside that probably, I think, accurately describes me on this issue. And I loved what you said about this discussion, the one that we're all having around the country and around the world, as an emotional one, which I have not heard. And Amy said to me that as we were talking about this debate, and I thought, I can't debate this because I'm all over the place. And she said, well, in your writing, you've been having a debate with yourself. And that's true, because this isn't a hero or criminal conversation for me. I come at this with a mixed mind. First and foremost, I'm a journalist, and as a journalist, I'm all about access to information. I think the American people deserve to know, need to know, ought to know, should know what the government is doing on its behalf in terms of protecting us and protecting our safety. You know, I think in that regard, what Edward Snowden has done has been an incredible service to the country, because now we know what the NSA has been doing all these years, and it's rather breathtaking what the NSA has been able to do. But then I come at this from the perspective of as an American, as a citizen, and I look at what Edward Snowden has done, and I wonder, okay, well, why didn't you go to Congress with this? With all the people on Capitol Hill who would love nothing better than to bury this president, there is no one on the Hill, in the House or the Senate, of any stature you could have gone to, taken this to, and gotten this information out that way. Why didn't he stay and face the consequences after revealing this information? Why did he leave Hawaii and go to Hong Kong/China? Why then did he go to Russia? And I'm not engaging in the debate of whether this, I think, silly debate about whether he's a spy that has popped up. That's not my concern. I don't think Edward Snowden is a spy, but I do wonder why he did not stay here, do what he did, and face the consequences. And I keep thinking about, and people have made the connection and the comparison with Daniel Ellsberg. Mr. Ellsberg himself has said that Edward Snowden is in his model, follows in his footsteps, and I can see why he would say that. But then, in writing the pieces that I've written, going back and reading about Ellsberg's history, to my mind, made Ellsberg a hero by comparison. Daniel Ellsberg went to Congress, and when members of Congress would do nothing about it, he went to the New York Times. When the New York Times was shut down in printing the Pentagon Papers, he went to the Washington Post. We printed printed the Pentagon Papers, and when that was shut down, he got those papers out to other newspapers around the country. Too, Daniel Ellsberg also went into hiding, but he didn't leave the country. He was in hiding in Cambridge. He was here in the United States. And then when when the pressure got really intense, he turned himself in. He went to the U.S. Attorney's office in Boston. He held himself accountable. He faced the music, for lack of a better description, for what he did. And Edward Snowden didn't do any of those things. And so that's why, Amy, when you see my writing, there is this debate within myself, because I understand and appreciate what he's done, what Edward Snowden has done, but there's a part of me that is extremely troubled by what he's done and the impact that it has had and will continue to have on the country, because as Amy pointed out and has been reported, not even the federal government knows exactly what Edward Snowden took with him, what journalists have in their hands. And you're right, I mean, I know at the paper, I'm on the editorial board, so I don't know what Barton Gellman has in the decision-making that's gone into, what's been reported, but this much I do know, they are being very careful and very judicious about what they're releasing, because, ultimately, does anyone want to be responsible for compromising national security in a serious way? So the discussion on clemency, some sort of plea bargain for Edward Snowden, I'd be curious as to what that is, but I do think Amy is right that Edward Snowden needs to come home, and I would love to see what that deal looks like. But I think that Edward Snowden should come back to the United States and be held accountable, however accountability is defined.
Yeah, of course, you don't ask the most troubling question about his behavior: why didn't he come to the New York Times? Which is unforgivable behavior by a true American. But Amy, you want to respond to that?
You raised a few things. It's funny because people often say, why didn't he go to Congress? When I think if you've been following this issue, one of the things that is most clearly come out is that Congress really failed and was failed in terms of oversight and disclosure. And one thing I've written about before is that if you had to pick out a single moment that most made the case for clemency of some kind for Snowden, it would be when Senator Wyden asked James Clapper, Director of National Intelligence, pretty directly, is there collection of data, of any sort of data on from millions of Americans? And he said no. And he very clearly, if you looked at the transcript, lied. And I think that it's really impossible to make the, if only he'd gone to Congress, it all would have worked argument, given what's happened in Congress in terms of oversight. You could also say, lying to Congress is a crime as well. And that nobody's really talked about. In a way, we have these sort of pocket clemencies for officials who've also committed crimes in the course of this. So I don't quite see. I think that there were, as you say, members of Congress who'd struggled with this issue, and they had not succeeded. And they had not been able to succeed partly because, as Wyden was felt very constrained by what he could say about classified information that he had seen.
And this gets to a question, as you were talking, and let's just play this out. Let's say Edward Snowden went to Wyden, because Wyden had been on the record for a long time.
Wyden had seen some of these things and had knowledge of them, but was unable to speak about them and unable to get them to the public through the means that we've been talking about.
So my question is, what would have happened if a third party, meaning a Snowden, had gone to Senator Wyden and said, "I've got this"? Then what could the senator have? What could the senator have done? Do we have any?
He could have done what he did in an open hearing with an official, asked a question designed to start the debate that we needed to have, and been openly lied to. I think it's really hard to say, and we expect everybody to be perfectly wise about the whole galaxy of choices that they have. That's not entirely realistic. And again, we're not quite talking, the subject here is Edward Snowden perfect, and has every judgment in every step he's made worked. I mean, it sounds sort of obvious to say, but we wouldn't be talking about amnesty or clemency if he hadn't committed very serious crimes. You don't need clemency if you haven't committed a crime. So that I think is clear. Things have happened, but we have these mechanisms like amnesty, clemency, plea bargains, because we realize that sometimes there are issues that you have to you have these two things and you have to find a way to make them work together, and they don't naturally.
Let me just jump in here for a second, because Jonathan raised a lot of things about Edward Snowden's behavior that concern people. And do those count in your calculus of whether he's entitled to clemency or not? Is his behavior relevant?
We talked about conflating things, and one thing that I think's really been conflated is the idea of, hero, patriot, and martyr. I don't think that part of it is what we necessarily need to ask of people. I also wonder, Daniel Ellsberg, by the way, was spared conviction because of a finding of government misbehavior in it. We have all of these mechanisms in the law to find ways not to convict people if we think that there is bad government behavior on the other side in some ways. But that's, aside from that, I think that it's the question of, should he have come back and faced the music? Did he need to do that in order for this to be, for him to be a nice man, for this to be a story where he's deserving of clemency? I don't quite see it that way. I don't see why that's an element of it. One of the issues is that I'm not actually convinced that he could do what he had done. If he had immediately turned himself in the day after this came out, I don't think that we necessarily would have heard a word that he said about his motives, at least in the short term. I don't know that it would have had that same access to what he said, or if journalists would have been able to have the same conversations with him. So I mean, that's another question.
Jonathan, let's pick up on the Ellsberg point, because you've raised this in your writings, you've raised it here, and of course you hate when this happens. Daniel Ellsberg said he did the right thing by running. Daniel Ellsberg has now said that. Daniel Ellsberg said that because he said, I walked into that Cambridge courtroom, I walked out that day. Okay, and I never went to jail pending trial. Look at what happened to Private Manning. But why does it matter, Snowden's behavior? Shouldn't it be judged by whether, in fact, it's been good for the American public to know these things?
But that's not. That can't be the only thing. It gets to, the word that comes to mind is credibility. One of the things that people are trying to do to erode Edward Snowden's credibility is now discharge that he's a Russian spy, to try to diminish the import of what he did in terms of awakening the American people to the incredible things that the National Security Administration has been doing in their name. that's why I think his behavior is important. I mean, I think he could have done those interviews that he did with Barton Gellman at the Washington Post and Glenn Greenwald at the Guardian, the videotaped interviews that he did, and release all those papers, and still turn himself in, because by then people would have heard. He would have been able to say his piece, his motivations, everything that he said, and then be held accountable. Now, excuse me, I understand and recognize and certainly appreciate that the world Daniel Ellsberg operated in, and where he released the Pentagon Papers and he walked into that Cambridge courtroom and walked out the same day, is not the same world that Edward Snowden is in. And I know that, and I'm perfectly aware and appreciate that the fate that could have befallen him is the same one that happened to Chelsea Manning. But we'll never know.
Amy, let me take that same question. Is there something that you could find out about Snowden that would be your, okay, I'm going to go there, your Chris Christie moment where you go, oh man, I can't believe I've been taking the position I've been.
See, I'm glad I almost used Chris Christie as
part of an example. You know, if you found out that he actually had provided information to the Russians or engaged in other acts that we would all reasonably agree were spying, is the deal off the table?
It's so hypothetical.
I understand
it's saying if this case is different from the case that we have facts about in front of us now, and we're speculating widely. If it turns out that he poisons kittens, I mean, it's hard to say. I'd like to see those.
But I think it really goes to the bigger question of what are the rules for the next Edward Snowden?
Well, see, this gets to a funny thing about the question of clemency and pardons and the next Edward Snowden. We've been talking as though this is a really priceless commodity, this kind of deal or this kind of mercy, that we need to make sure that he's a good man, a man who's done no harm, a man who's impeccable in some ways. And yet, in our history, we've given pardons and clemencies a lot. You know, the Secretary of Defense for lying to Congress, Caspar Weinberger, a lot of people were pardoned in Iran-Contra, and I don't think that there was actually a whole, finding that they had never done anything wrong, that they had never harmed the country in any way. I think that Iran-Contra did harm the country, but there was a decision that it made sense to move to the next stage of a national conversation through that. We pardon people, draft dodgers, Confederate soldiers, the Whiskey Rebellion. We've done this in our history, and it's always been because we've thought about whether what just happened has gotten us to a place where we want to be as a country. And if then having a huge trial or punishing people who've done a lot of bad things. I'm not talking about Snowden specifically, but we've pardoned bad people in our country's history when we've had the sense that it makes the country stronger. Not always, and I would say that we haven't always made the right choices, and it hasn't always been, a good story. I mean, George Steinbrenner got a pardon for federal crimes at one point.
America got better the day Mark Rich got pardoned, and don't say it didn't. Yeah.
No, maybe Yankees fans do feel that is a pardon that made America stronger. I don't know if I totally agree, but and I don't think that it was given with the sense that he was a perfect man, and so I guess I shy away from that sort of angle, and I certainly do from sort of some of the hypotheticals, of whether he got the best advice in terms of where he should buy his next plane ticket. It's an interesting separate question.
But shouldn't we be concerned about what happened when he was in Hong Kong, in the transit area in Russia, about what government officials in those respective countries did?
And shouldn't we be concerned when he says to Brazil, if you give me asylum, I'll help you?
Yeah, I think that might be a little oversimplification of what he.
That's what I'm here for.
He wrote there. But look, we've got a guy who's 29, 30 years old. He's got to spend the rest of his life somewhere, and we need to, if he's saying I got to get out of Russia, Brazil, take me, these are, and again, I'm not holding up a big insta-free without any conversation sort of sign. I think that what makes sense is having these conversations and coming to some outcome that makes sense for.
But are you concerned about the questions Jonathan raised about what actually happened? I mean,
there's one way to find that out, and that's for him and his lawyers to have a conversation with the U.S. government and figure it out and come to some sort of arrangement or deal or some, and I think that they might be able to ask him that. Who knows? But I haven't actually. I feel like, it's funny. There are a lot of reports around. When we ran, Jane Mayer had a conversation with Edward Snowden on encrypted channels a couple of days ago, in which he very vehemently denied the whole what happened in Hong Kong scenario. So there's that. And I just haven't seen, a lot of people have been chasing that story, and I haven't seen them.
Right. Well, I guess I'd like both of you to react to what the president said to New Yorker editor David Remnick when he said, that the leaks raise legitimate policy questions, but is the only way to do that by giving some 29-year-old free rein to basically dump a mountain of information, much of which is definitely legal, definitely necessary for national security, and should be classified. I mean, if the positive outcome here is the debate, did we need all the other things, all the other disclosures?
I mean, we didn't have it before, and it's sort of another sort of strange. Obama's sort of take on this seems to be, if you guys had just given me time, I would have gotten to it, and I would have started this debate. But the reality is that we didn't have this debate before the disclosures. I'd also say that one thing that we've learned in the course of this is that maybe too much is classified, and that there are things that we've learned. It's not only that we've learned secrets, and it's not only that we've learned secret law, which I think is one of the most important parts of this. Learning some of the Edward Snowden revelations have really been about how the government reads the law, things that aren't operational, aren't even about programs. They're really about what words mean, and that really did need to be out there, and so should never have been classified in the first place. So maybe one thing when the president is asking, does it have to be that a 29-year-old has free rein to dump all of this information? One wonders why there's so much classified information, so much that a 29-year-old has access to. And that's sort of part of the government wants to ask a question of itself about overclassification to the extent that it has to give so many people access to it to do their jobs, and about its own security. Those are good questions, but I'm not sure that they're the questions that have to do with what happens legally to Snowden now.
In that Remnick interview, which I read in its entirety on the train up, if you haven't read it yet, it's 32 printed pages. But one of the things that comes across, and is something that if you've been paying attention and paying attention to the president as a reader and as a reporter, paying attention to him as someone covered, this is a man who campaigned one way. I'm going to close Guantanamo Bay. I'm going to end the wars, which he's successfully doing. I'm going to do all these things that the American people want. It's campaign. He gets into the White House, and now he gets to see all the stuff he was not able to see as a candidate. Now he's president. And in that quote, what I saw was sort of the constitutional law professor who understands and knows the law and thinks that things should happen a certain way, smack up against the duties and responsibilities of commander-in-chief.
You know,
And so now he's faced with, and I think he says in the interview, my #1 job is to keep the American people safe. And so he's getting these daily briefings. He's got the intelligence reports. He sees the hell and mayhem that none of us, thankfully, get to see on a day-to-day basis. When he says, though, that the NSA is doing things that are legal, and you mentioned the FISA court, well, the FISA court's a secret court. So a secret court is declaring what the NSA has done as being legal, but we don't know really the rationale behind why the FISA court says these things are legal. So, hell, if I'm having a debate within myself in my writing, imagine what it must be like for this particular president, given who he is.
it's funny because this sort of journey that Obama has taken, from the guy who wanted to rein in the NSA to the one who, faced with the responsibilities, let them do a lot more, is often sort of talked about as a positive journey. And I'm not sure it is, but I also think that the president doesn't discredit the constitutional law professor. We all have roles here, and if he's fulfilling one role and the Congress is fulfilling another and the press is another, one way that our system recalibrates when one body in it goes too far is by others going too far or others pushing. And I think that pushing is, we just got to a moment where that in some ways was ready to happen, and the means it happened by was Edward Snowden. It was not, strangely, the one that some people thought it would be, the election of Barack Obama. It wasn't, we didn't get to that point in our post 9/11 recalibration by electing a constitutional law professor, but we got to it. And that, I think, is in some ways a tribute to the many means that we have to get there. It's, and the many, the role of the press, the many ways that we do have to sort of reel things back.
But let me put the president's remark in a broader context, which is, isn't there something really scary about a system where we're going to put the decision in the hands of somebody like Edward Snowden and then not punish him, right? I mean, you're obviously going to have to put classified information in the hands of people who can, I'm not going to bring up the oath word, but I've read it, but in violation of their duty to their employer or their country, they release it. And if you don't have punishment in that system, how do you keep from having leaks that hurt?
You might also ask, if you don't have punishment for the NSA overreaching, how are they not going to? If you don't have punishment for anybody who's been involved in illegal detentions or torture, and we really haven't, that's a question that comes up a lot. But I also think that it's the thing that puzzles me about that is, what exactly do we see as punishment? I mean, are we going to feel better about this if, Edward Snowden has a sort of time in solitary confinement that Chelsea Manning did say? Or, it's clear that Edward Snowden, nobody's talking about giving him a villa in Hawaii and having him sort of, rewarded forever. I think it's not as though we should just keep in mind he hasn't given up anything. He had a life before and he has a very different life now. Whether that's adequate, but I wonder who we're satisfying when we talk about, punishment in that way. I also really do wonder if any of these things are true deterrents. All that the punishment of Chelsea Manning did was cause Edward Snowden to decide that he had to flee the country, so that didn't stop him from doing this. I think that the real deterrent, if we're worried again about this, and I've said this before and I'm slightly obsessed with it, but is overclassification, which is why all of these slightly random young people have access to so much information, because there's so much that's classified at a high level that you need to give for the government to function, you have to give a shocking number of people top, high security clearances. So I think in terms of how do we prevent the next Edward Snowden, how do we prevent like all of our very private information from being like suddenly revealed with no punishment, there are ways to address that, I think, that don't have to do with long jail sentences.
You want to speak to the punishment point, Jonathan?
Yeah, I think Edward Snowden should be held accountable. Should he go to Club Fed?
With Clapper, we're down with that.
I do think
that would make Amy happy. We're there. Okay.
I mean, part of being held accountable or punishment is to let the next person know, here's what's going to happen if you do this again. And I think just sort of institutionally, the federal government and the administration wants to send the signal that, hey, you other Edward Snowden wannabes, don't even think about this happening. The fact that Edward Snowden is, living outside the country, yeah, he's given up a lot. He's left his family, he's left his livelihood, so on and so forth. But he's not. He's not in jail.
There are other, and I hasten to say that it's true that some people like that kind of thing.
And for some people,
but I would say that we keep talking when the government says we need to prevent the next Edward Snowden. I wonder exactly what they mean. Do they just mean somebody who releases a lot of things that happen to have a high security clearance, or somebody who releases things that embarrass the government? Cause people to be angry and get us to question, how our state institutions are operating. Because if you want to prevent the next Edward Snowden, maybe make sure that your intelligence agencies aren't spying on Americans. And that's probably the best way, because if there was nothing to reveal, there wouldn't be an Edward Snowden in that sense. It's not just the classification of the documents he released that makes him what he is.
John,
I'm completely with you on the government's overclassification of documents, which is something that goes back to the Bush administration and hasn't been curtailed by the Obama administration. But when I talk about preventing the next Edward Snowden, a couple of the other things that trouble me about what he's done is he was only at his last job for 3 months. The agency, Booz Allen, the agency that vetted him, that did the background check, if I remember correctly, today is under investigation by the federal government for doing botched background checks for thousands of people. Right. There are thousands of people employed or as contractors, not even employed by the federal government, employed by a third party who have high security clearances, who could be the next person to walk out the door with thousands upon thousands of documents that embarrass the government, that endanger national security, that could mean nothing because, as you've rightly said, so many documents that the government has are stamped classified when they really don't need to be. So that's the thing about Snowden, that the idea that he was in that job for 3 months as a contractor, his background check being botched by another entity, and he was able to have access to unbelievable amounts of information.
Right. Well, and the last time I was here, I obviously spoke to this point that the leak prosecutions, I think, are a real danger to democracy. Overclassification is an incredible danger to democracy. The government has brought on a lot of this themselves. And you look at the NSA and you say, who are the people they should have been watching? Edward Snowden and the 2 guys who blew up the Boston Marathon. And the Russians are going, that's the guy. That's the guy, you should watch him. And instead they're collecting millions and millions of records about other people and apparently not finding the bad guys. That said, though, despite my position on all those issues, it troubles me that there is a disclosure as a result of this that the Swedes are helping us spy on the Russians, because I think the Russians should be spied on. They are human rights violators, and if the Swedes are going to help us, let them. Okay? And that's the thing that concerns me, is that why is that report out there, and should we have a system that allows that?
Well, see, I mean, that's the other thing about all this. I understand that diplomacy, and especially espionage, because that's what it is, needs, a bit of secrecy. There are lots of things that the government does on our behalf that we don't know about and we shouldn't know about, and the folks who were doing this too shouldn't know about it, because guess what? They're doing it to us. When the president of Brazil flipped out and got mad because she found out that the NSA had been spying on her cell phone, I completely get that. I mean, no one wants to be spied on their cell phone, or the German Chancellor Angela Merkel finding out that the NSA was spying on her cell phone. I get that, but then we find out a few weeks down the road that the Brazilians were spying on us. And I know from friends in the government that this sort of cross-national spying, even among our friends, I won't name the embassy, but a friend of mine worked at a major embassy in a major country, and there is a room in the embassy that is lined just like a plastic tent, where if they're going to have conversations that they don't want to be overheard, like guaranteed, or as much as they could, that they won't be overheard, they go into this plastic tent within a room to minimize, spying. This is in the country of a friend. So the idea that, what the NSA is doing or has done or continues to do is something that only they are doing is ridiculous.
I think, first of all, that when we talk about some deal for Snowden, part of that deal wouldn't be repealing laws on classified information or on the foreign spying that the NSA can do. I think that the interesting thing about and what's striking about some of the revelations about foreign spying, in some areas we learn ways that the NSA has kind of gotten in the way of the Constitution, or sort of compromised the Constitution at home, and then we learn just that they've been very clumsy abroad. There's been and that's good to know, because if they're not being watched, if there's not oversight, if they're possibly bungling foreign policy by being a little too clumsy and a little too greedy and a little too not surgical enough, good to know. I mean, that's also one of those points where you just decide that any government agency ought to be run better. And I think that's I agree that it's not an absolute scandal that we're spying on foreign countries. But, if we're doing it in a dumb way that's going to make it harder for us to get information, that's another sort of problem, but it's also a problem, I think.
Do you think that this incident with the Snowden documents has been an indictment of the mainstream media? Has their failure, as some people suggested after 9/11, to really hold the government accountable created?
I mean, I think the media's done a lot of, when one says the media, Jonathan and I we're all part of the media. That's
why I'm looking for you to say something really flattering.
So
the answer is no to my question.
This is where I have to be held accountable and pay the price. But no, I mean, I think that the media has done some really, really important things since 9/11, and I think it's missed some really, really important things, and that's always going to be true. But I think that it's been in this area kind of helpful.
Are you going to agree
what
with
she
that?
said?
Well, that brings, I guess, around to the public part of this, and you saw, I'm sure, that the Pew results came out the other day, and they're sort of strange in that if you look at the actual numbers, because right now, according to the Pew research, 45% of the people think that the disclosures serve the public interest. 43% think not. The rest are, they're dining with 8-year-olds in Georgia trying to figure out what to think. But even though 45% of the people think that the public interest was served, 56% think there should be a criminal case. And you sort of try to wrap your head around those numbers, but does it matter? I mean, is the public opinion on this surprise you, and what should you make of it?
I think that should there be a criminal case? Is that how the question
was? That's how the question was phrased, yeah.
You know, there is a criminal case. Again, this is, I mean, that can mean so many things. Like, there should be a criminal case, but I hope he only gets 3 months. There should be a criminal case, and I hope he's executed. Both of those sentiments exist, and they're both covered by that answer. So the real argument now is, if we all assume that some crimes have been committed, and I don't think there's anybody who thinks that no crime has been committed, it's just a matter of whether it's a crime that was, you know, helpful in the best interest of the country, had all these mitigating things, then what's the disposition of that? How do we move forward thinking about that? And luckily, we happen to have a criminal justice system that has mechanisms for that, where, you know, pardon and clemency and plea bargain, those aren't terms we have to invent for this case. Those aren't things like special Snowden Golden Star dispensation that we have to suddenly come up with now. They exist, and they exist for a reason.
I like that Q poll, because as you read it, I thought, oh wow, I'm actually with those folks. Yes, I think the public disclosure is great. Yes, I think he should be. When I hear should be, what was the question? Should be criminally.
Whether there should be a criminal case.
Whether there should be a criminal case, I take that to mean. I wonder if the people who were queried took that to mean held accountable. And so if that's the case, then, you know, I'm there too. I think that this is the public disclosure. I support the public disclosure, but I also think that he should be held accountable for what he's done. Because as we've all discussed, and as you said, he's broken laws. So,
but what do you mean by that? Do you see him coming back to the United States, standing trial, and putting the system on trial? Putting the law on trial?
I mean, why not? I mean, he says in all of his interviews that he has done this so that we can know what our government is doing. So, let's say, again, in hypotheticals, they work out a deal, he comes back, he testifies in court, and then he puts the system on trial, he puts the government on trial. I think that would be an incredible. It would add to the service he has already done, if you want to be generous about it.
Jonathan asked me why not, but you can answer. I mean, would there be a value in having him come back and face charges?
Again, I keep going back to this. You know, it's not every sort of point where we look and say somebody has broken the law, or even where they come into the criminal justice system, ends with a trial. And it often doesn't. And so the question is whether there is some way, and I you know, in terms of him speaking, him being spoken, you know, asked serious questions, it doesn't seem like Moscow is the best place for that to happen. You know, so if we think that there's some benefit into really interrogating him, not in the sense of interrogating somebody in a dark room, but, you know, asking somebody serious, hard questions and knowing that you're going to get a non-hedged answer that's not dependent on, like, who's watching me and who's down the street. You know, there's also a benefit in bringing him back here. So even
if he doesn't have the documents anymore, which he says, and even though he's lost control of them.
I think, you know, there's a lot to learn. I think that anybody would say.
Before we go to...
Including, you know, the government says, again, is that they're not entirely sure of the parameters of this particular leak.
Before we get some questions from the larger group here, Have you been surprised by the government's reaction? Have you been surprised that the government seems to have been fairly passive, right?
I've been really surprised by one aspect of it, which is that it turns out that the NSA they're really bad liars. They're not really good at sort of the thing that we expect from politicians and government officials, which is going out and sort of saying something that's kind of, you know, slippery, and in retrospect you look back and you realize that although you thought it meant one thing, technically they were, you know, they've kind of just been really clumsy about it. They've often more than once said something to explain one document that in another document that came out soon after that turned out to just be wrong or not true. So the extent that the NSA hasn't, in a way, had to lie because they've kept so much so secret, they seem out of practice at it, and that kind of surprised me a little bit.
Your spy agency should be good at lying. You would hope that. One of the things.
If nothing else, so I was a little surprised by that, and I think that what people have been most surprised by is the revelation. The President's Advisory Board has found this, and others have, that a lot of the most aggressive data collection didn't actually get them anything. You know, that it doesn't seem to have really contributed to keeping us safe. And I think that I mean, I don't know if that personally shocked me, but I think that really surprised, for example, I can't remember who, but somebody on the President's Advisory Board on surveillance said that was the real surprise for him, the moment when he had a briefing with some intelligence agencies and expected to hear about, you know, dozens of plots that had been foiled and didn't. And I'll get his exact words wrong, but he said something to himself like, so what are we doing here exactly? And so I think that for many people has been surprising as well in all of this.
I think the NSA is probably very good at lying, just not in public, just not exposed in this way. And also, I wonder if they're so clumsy is because now that they're out in the public and the public's paying attention and lawmakers are paying attention, that they could end up violating some law. You know, so they might go out and like lie and say, oh, that's not true. And then the piece of paper that they thought was classified and no one had drops, and it reveals that they're lying. Well, then, yeah, they're gonna look clumsy. But I think the reason why the reaction, you call the reaction of the government passive, which is not what I was thinking. I mean, I thought that the government's reaction is what I thought it would be, which is, you know, they don't like what Edward Snowden has done. They're horrified by it. They're freaked out by it because they don't know the extent to which what he's done. But it also, I think, the more I thought about it, perhaps the reaction is a reflection of this president. No drama, Obama. This president doesn't
draw the line.
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't. Rage is not in his DNA. He's not a president who will take to the podium and say, this is outrageous, this is, you know, harmed national security. There's no heat there. When he speaks of Edward Snowden or NSA leaks or anything, it's all very thoughtful on the one hand, on the other hand, I see, but you know, I mean, if that's passive, okay, but I mean, that's the president that we have.
Yeah. Let me jump in here and then go to Amy on this. But you know, look at the English. You know, they have long discussions with the Guardian and then make them destroy the one copy of it that they have in the office after they're told, well, there are other copies elsewhere. They then decide that they'll have a parliamentary hearing. We received a letter for, we provide answers, which had a 10-week period for us to think of answers. There's been no sense that there is any sort of emergency, there's any sort of haste.
There have been more and more members of Congress who say, you know, actually I didn't get it, really. You also have members of Congress who are still on television talking about the Russians. But I think that there has actually been a surprising phenomenon, I guess you'd call it, of politicians changing their mind on this, which is not something that you would necessarily always see.
Well, and I think the survey results we're talking also, it's not as if the public is outraged, and so the government, I think, to some extent is taking the tone. But the last thing I read before I left, because it hangs by our elevator bank, is the telegram that was sent by the Mitchell Attorney General's office at the time of the Pentagon Papers. And the last sentence in there, it says, please give the papers back. You would think they would at least ask that much. I mean, even Nixon thought of that, you know. Show some interest, folks.
Thank you so much for participating. Thank our panelists. It was a wonderful evening.